Hello, hi, how are you? And welcome to another podcast by George. And today, we're at the alma mater. We're back home. It reminds me of Jason Bourne going back to where it all began. I'm back in the offices of the journalism department, and today we're visiting with Kathleen Richardson. She's the dean and professor of media law. Kathleen worked at the Des Moines Register for 20 years in a variety of newsroom jobs: copy editor, copy desk chief, wire editor, news editor, features editor, book reviewer, and columnist. So I guess you could say at the Register she did just about everything. She taught part-time at the Drake School of Journalism and Mass Communication for several years before joining the faculty in 2001. She was director of the school from 2007 to 2014 and has been dean since 2014. Now, she's also the executive director of the Iowa Freedom of Information Council. That's a nonprofit organization that promotes open government. That was from 2000 to 2015. And in that role, she produced educational materials on the state's open meetings and records laws. Man, that's important. Conducted workshops and answered citizens and journalists' inquiries. And so she should be good at maybe answering some of my questions today, I hope. By the way, she was a founding member of the Iowa Public Information Board, a state agency that helps enforce the open government laws. She's been given the Iowa Newspaper Association Distinguished Service Award, the Governor's Volunteer Award, honored by the state judicial branch for her service to the state legal system, and named an Iowa Watch Free Press champion and Iowa State University Greenlee School Friend of the First Amendment. And so, Kathleen, when I read that bio, what comes to my mind is, did I squander my career? I'm a slump with a podcast. I mean, and I mean that's great stuff. That's a great career, and it's still going here at Drake. Yeah. Yeah,
I'm still here. Well, except that I am still at Drake because I was a Drake alum as well as you are, and I'm still here, but you have gone on to greater things. So.
Oh well, maybe that's one way of looking at it. Well, I'm really tickled to have you on the podcast, and I got to be real truthful with you. The reason that I reached out at this time, and I had planned to do this, but I got to get a hold of Kathleen. I got to talk to somebody down there at Drake. The genesis, the upshot for this podcast actually was this recent turn of events with, Donald Trump, of course, and that's an ongoing thing. But that presidential news conference here just in the past week or two, where Jim Acosta had his credentials revoked, and the intern tried to grab his microphone, and Trump carried on like, oh my God, that's such a change, such a departure from what journalism, broadcast news was, what I knew it to be. I mean, jump in the Wayback Machine here with me a little bit. We were both at Drake at about the same time. You know, in the mid to late 70s, we were post-Vietnam War, we were post-Watergate. Journalists, broadcast news people that I looked up to were admired. They were revered. I mean, I remember my relatives saying, my dad, my son's going to Drake. My grandmother, my grandson's going to be on the radio. I mean, now there are people that believe journalists are the enemy of the people.
Yes. I guess I think of it as it's the worst of times, it's the best of times. At the one hand, we have a lot of people who are very critical of journalists and very suspicious of the news media. But on the other hand, at journalism schools around the country right now, some of them are seeing an uptick in enrollment. And I was talking to a friend of mine the other day, who a former coworker at the Des Moines Register, and she was pointing out that because the media is in such disarray at the moment, that people are starting to realize the importance of good journalism again.
Well, I hope so. I'm glad that you're maybe a harbinger of that. I hope that's true. I don't know what to make of it. The negativism, and I just had Kyle Munson on the podcast.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah, and he mentioned the museum.
Right.
And the thing I pointed out to him was, if folks ever get an opportunity to tour that, remember the journalists that died reporting, particularly in wars.
Oh, yeah.
To bring home this news to people. Fair and balanced, but yeah, I mean, life and death. I mean, that's kind of the way that I look at it, and I feel badly about it. So answer this for me: why doesn't the journalism community, and I'm thinking of the White House press pool, but maybe it's because of the diversity of the stations and companies that are represented in that, why don't they band together a little bit more and say, look, no, I'm not going to ask a question until you answer his.
Mm-hmm. I've read that quite a bit. There seems to be differing opinions about that. I know that after the most recent incident when the CNN reporter was kicked out of the White House press briefings, and there was some talk about should the media get together and say, okay, none of us will participate until all of us can participate. But it's a competitive business, certainly in the current environment, and certainly television news. And I think that the other viewpoint that I read was that it's important for journalists to be at the table. That it is their responsibility to cover what the president said.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so that it is kind of an ethical responsibility to continue doing their jobs. There's two sides of it.
I guess you can't really weaponize it. The other way that I look at it is because of all the media platforms that are available to somebody like Trump, as an example, if they take away that presidential news conference, he's all right. He may be better off even. Now, back in the day, he needed that. The president, if he needed that forum, that was important to him. But Sarah Huckabee and Donald Trump could shut that thing down tomorrow, and they've got plenty of opportunities and ways to reach, particularly their base, without that presidential news conference.
Yeah, that's an important point.
It's interesting. I'll give you this angle. This is very personal. I was at WHO. I covered all manner and means of stories, everything that came down the pike. I kind of specialized in live breaking news, police and fire stuff. But I also covered politics at times and some investigative stuff also. And the way that I put it to people is the Register, which you're well acquainted with, has been accused of being left-wing. A lot of people quit subscribing to it because they thought that it was a mouthpiece, really, for liberals. But I covered the same stories that they did for over 5 years, and you always compare notes. I would always look at my account, my reading, my reporting of a story, and compare that against the Register's version. Mm-hmm. And not once, with dozens, I don't know, maybe hundreds of stories that I covered, did I ever look at that and say, oh, there's bias. Mm-hmm. They didn't tell the truth. That's fake news. If it had been, it would have behooved me to bring that point forward because we were a competitor. I never saw that.
Right.
Not once.
Well, and I was thinking about that just this morning as I was thinking about our discussion. And during my time in the newsroom, we would get complaints from both sides. We'd have people calling in and complaining that, we were biased one way, and then other people calling in and complaining that we were biased the other way. And kind of the common wisdom was, well, if you've got people on both sides complaining, then you're probably doing a pretty good job, of staying in the middle.
In the middle. And I used to think of myself that way. And it was much easier back in the day to be that way. And again, I was a police and fire guy, so I didn't get involved in the matches on the political side too much. But I had to give it up. I can't. There's no middle anymore. I don't see it. I'm about as liberal and left-wing leaning as you can get now. I've become that. This is what it's forced me in. I just view it as truth. It's just the way things are. That's the way that I see it, and I tell it like it is. So maybe they've created an enemy. I don't know.
Well, it's a very polarizing environment, political environment, and so it's very challenging for journalists to work in. I was invited to take part in a public radio show before the election, last presidential election, and to talk about the media coverage of the election. And so I kind of prepared ahead of time by calling up some of my former students and actually talking to some of my current students who were covering politics and asking them how they felt their education prepared them, for working in the current environment. And I have to say it was very, it made me feel really good, because I had one student who was working for a TV station in Iowa reporting on the presidential campaign, and he said that it was challenging just because there's so many demands on journalists now. Not only do they have to be on TV, but then they also have to be on social media all the time. There just really isn't enough time to really stop and think. You know, you have to kind of make decisions on the fly and always produce constantly. But he said, you know, he tried to learn the things that he learned in journalism school, to try to be fair to both sides, play it down the middle. He did the best he could. And I also talked to a current student, a young woman who had the opportunity to go to the Democratic convention and cover that for a magazine, and the Republican convention. And so I asked her, I said, like, how difficult was it for you to remain fair? And she said, you know, I'm from Shenandoah, Iowa. I just think of a friend that I grew up with. We have very different political views, but when I'm telling a story, I try to, you know, I think of my friend and think, well, what would she think of this? And I thought that was what we all should be doing as journalists.
It's interesting, the example you cited for the broadcast person with the social media responsibilities. I kind of flip it a little bit. The newspaper reporters back in my day, they were almost invisible. They had a byline on the article, but they didn't even include photos. You didn't see them very often. They lived with the written word, basically. Right. Now, political reporters, they're on TV. Mm-hmm. I mean, you see those everywhere. They can't just be a writer behind the scenes and live in newsprint. They've got to live electronically, representing their points of view. Well, you know, here you are. On the podcast, very similar to that.
I often wonder what they think, too, because especially nowadays, as I said, the media market is so competitive, and that in order to drive readership, print journalists are required to go on social media to promote their work, go on TV to promote what they're doing. And I think it does have a tendency to kind of blur the lines a little bit, and maybe it does kind of hurt the journalist's credibility, because one of the big problems in the media now is that it's hard for your average consumer to pick apart the journalism and the opinion, right?
Yeah.
Because it's all kind of washing together in the same pool.
Right. And what do you see as the future for major metropolitan newspapers? I mean, circulations are dwindling still, although I've heard that I think the New York Times circulation has been increasing. I mean, that's what I've heard, maybe because of all the political infighting. But are the newspapers going to continue to survive?
Yeah, well, I certainly hope so. You know, we can talk more about, you know, the importance of having a credible news operation, newspaper operation to a community. But from what I see, the major metropolitan dailies, the New York Times, the Washington Post, a few others are managing to survive and maybe even thrive because of the current climate where everybody is desperate for news about what's coming out of Washington. At the same time, it's the community journalism, you know, basically the middle-sized newspapers like the Des Moines Register, maybe even in, you know, Omaha World Herald, Kansas City newspaper, things like this that are struggling. The smaller town newspapers still, I think, are doing okay because they're the only show in town, you know, that they're kind of holding their community together. But it's the community journalism that's really having a hard time at the moment.
I encourage everybody to subscribe to the daily newspaper. I mean, here in Des Moines, in Iowa, subscribe to the Register. Back, it used to be, well, I don't like the mess. I don't like the newspaper every day. I don't like going to the mailbox or whatever the case. Well, okay, it's digital. Right. You know, I don't like the expense. Oh, it's pretty cheap. I mean, sign up. Otherwise, you're just sitting in a camp. You're just cherry-picking broadcasts and podcasts, and you're just a Sean Hannity versus a Rachel Maddow person. You've got to get a broader perspective than that. And I'm really amazed at a lot of my friends that consider themselves to be political wonks almost, don't even read a newspaper.
Right. Well, they might find that they're reading online news that's produced by a newspaper somewhere, but they're just getting it for free because they're freeloading. But there's a lot of, the big discussion now is about the news deserts, the places in the country where there really is that the newspapers are struggling, and so it has a wider impact on the community. I think now we're finally getting to the point where people are realizing that, okay, if I don't have a strong newspaper in my community, I don't know what in the heck is going on.
Exactly. Yeah.
Except what I can pick up through word of mouth and Facebook.
And I guess that's enough for some people, but it shouldn't be. These are critical times that we live in. I think back to the day again, and my time here in the broadcast news department at Drake. There wasn't anybody that I can remember that would have supported what's going on now, particularly from the right. I mean, did you read the news about that video being altered that Sarah Huckabee released? Yeah, that Jim Acosta incident again. That some frames had been removed from that video to make it appear to be a more violent jerking motion when she tried to take the microphone from him. I can't imagine anybody in that field of endeavor, broadcast news, that would support or be behind or a believer of that administration or those politics with that type of thing taking place. To me, that is absolutely beyond the pale. I don't want to get on too much of a soapbox, but I can't imagine that. That's propaganda. I mean, that's bad stuff. How do people? Do you, in your journalism student body now, do you have people that support that point of view or that are behind that? Do you have real diehard, like Trump-based right-wingers in journalism schools now?
I don't know. We don't get into heavy-duty political discussions in a lot of the classes that I teach. We have students from across the political spectrum who are interested in working in communications. One of our majors, we not only teach journalism, but we also teach public relations and strategic political communication. So we do have students who are interested in going into politics, and so they don't necessarily have to, go down the middle of the road. They can have their political opinions, and they do work for political campaigns. But I like to think that in the School of Journalism here, and especially at Drake, the students are able to talk to each other across the political divide. They're still able to be civil and to have intelligent conversations and discussions, even if they disagree with each other.
Emphasis on intelligent.
Right.
Well,
and that's what we're trying to encourage. I mean,
sure.
that's our whole goal here, is to try to encourage intelligent civil discussion.
Yeah, that's well said. The disciplines here, of course, newspaper, magazines. You still have radio, TV, broadcast. What's that department? Mass media, social media. How's that all bundled now?
We and we reorganized a few years ago, and it to better reflect what was going on out in the real world of media. The broadcast news and the I don't even know if there is a print news. It's multimedia journalism has been combined into a news major. And because both students who are interested in multimedia journalism, print journalism, broadcast journalism, still nowadays need to know all the same things. They need to know how to report, write, but also do audio, video, photography, all that kind of stuff, and social media. And then we have the digital media production side of the house, which is more audio-visual production, but also, building websites and, social media, that kind of thing.
I wondered coming in here, I was thinking, with all of this enemy of the people stuff and so many people that don't like reporters and newspapers, and what about numbers generally, journalism majors? How does that compare back to when we were here?
I think that it's, overall it's about the same. The enrollment is about the same. And as I mentioned earlier, a lot of journalism programs around the country are experiencing a little bit of a bump because people are consuming news more and they're more into it. I would say that the what the students are interested in might have shifted. Less interested in traditional, print journalism. Still quite a bit of interest in broadcast journalism, but students tell me that what they are interested in. I was just talking with a group of first-year students this morning, and they say, we were talking about what we can do, how we can use our voices to help change and heal the world. And they were saying, well, I'm interested in journalism because we tell people stories, right? We help give people who might not have the opportunity to have their voices heard and their stories heard, we give them a platform for doing that, as well as give them information. And so I thought that was great.
Yeah, that is great. I like that. That's great stuff. I'm glad to hear that the journalism department's alive and well. I'm enjoying my time here at Drake, seeing everybody, and it's amazing that the offices and the building and everything is pretty much like it was when I was here. I was out at that rally yesterday. That was gratifying. I've got a podcast up about that. It was really great to see an energized student body, see the turnout. 800 people out there. That's a big rally. That's a big turnout at a school like Drake. You get 800 people together out there on the Commons. That's a big deal.
We had some discussion this morning among the students about exactly how many people were there. There was, I think Drake Security was saying there was over 3,000 people, and I don't know.
Oh, is that right?
I don't know if that's true or not. It's hard to tell when you're right in the middle of the crowd.
Right.
But there was quite a big crowd there.
Yeah, that's great. It speaks well of Drake University. Well, before we end the podcast, is there anything that I didn't ask that I probably should have? Is there anything that you think people should know about? The state of journalism or the state of journalism at Drake University?
Well, I often tell people that one of the few places in the world that there's still a lot of optimism and hope about the future of journalism is in a journalism school, because you have all of these bright, energetic, curious, creative students who are here, and they are ready to go out and change the world. And I truly believe from my experience of working with these students, that they're going to do it. The future is theirs. They have to figure out how to make it profitable. They have to figure out how they're going to make it work financially.
That's an issue. That's why I got out of it.
From not only personally, but also how to build a media that people will pay for. But they'll figure it out. I'm very and from talking to our alums and hearing about how much they appreciate all of the education in ethics and excellence in journalism and mass communication that they got from their Drake experience, it makes me feel real good.
That makes me feel good, too. That's a great point to stop. Let's put a bow on it and call that the podcast. That's great. Our guest today, Kathleen Richardson, the Dean of Journalism at Drake University. Thanks again, everybody, for listening in. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and listen to us on Spotify and, iHeartRadio app and all of those various places. We're going to continue to grow this and talk to great people and leaders in industries like journalism. Kathleen Richardson, that's great. Thanks for listening. That's another podcast by George.